All right, this is the second part of chapter one. We're going to talk about, as you see listed on the screen, are four of the guided reading questions that you should be able to answer after watching this video. We're going to, and they really should be in order. Every now and again, there's an element maybe that you might want to add to a question that you're going to see later on. But for the most part, they should kind of go in order. So the first question we're going to delve into is, how did new technology contribute to the age of exploration? We're going to talk about some of the different historical and technological contributions. What was the primary motivation for King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain to finance Columbus's voyage? What were living conditions for an average person like in Europe in the Middle Ages in the 17th century? And then, despite more advanced ships and capabilities than Europeans, why didn't China engage in exploration and colonization? So we're going to answer all of those questions and more. So hopefully this will be good for you. Now, we kind of talked about this before in the last video. Trade obviously was a gigantic issue during the 1400s into the 1500s, and going along like land trade routes were very slow, very cumbersome, tough to get the bulk, the quantity of goods that you wanted to really make a profit and be able to satisfy all the wants and needs of your consumers. So because of that, we had to kind of develop these routes. And one of the more famous routes was the Silk Road, which led from China. And they named it the Silk Road because China was very known for their silk, also for porcelain and other luxury goods. So they would ship their silk, porcelain, other goods along the Silk Road, trade them with like Muslim traders. Muslim traders would then kind of continue the journey, and there would be all these stops in various towns called oasis towns, where again you would exchange ideas, cultural ideas, religious ideas, and then obviously you would make your trades. And eventually the goods would make their way to these Western European countries like England and France, and so on. Now, this was, again, a very, very slow process to get from all these spots. And they were all these different intermediaries in the middle. Like we mentioned, those Muslim Middle Eastern countries. And every time you make a trade, obviously everybody wants to make a profit on that trade, so prices went up. So people started thinking, man, if we could get this from the source, then we wouldn't have to pay these gigantic prices. So countries started to think of ways when they could, how they could get these from the source. Portugal was very integral in leading the way in an alternate method. They really developed their shipping industry. Now, one of the things they did, now this wasn't exactly technology, but it kind of was. They started charting different currents and how kind of the waterways worked. So what would be the best routes, how the currents would kind of speed up or slow down an expedition. So Portugal was really at the forefront of let's use the water as a quicker means to transport these goods. A guy by the name of Prince Henry the Navigator was instrumental in this and trying to make these routes. He learned of a guy from Portugal named Prester John who was looking to convert Africans and introduce new religious ideas. So Prince Henry thought, like, there's money to be made there. If we have some people in Africa already, maybe we can kind of go around Africa and establish trading posts there. In essence, cutting out the middlemen, those Muslim traders. So that's exactly what Portugal did. They started looking for routes in Africa. They also kind of expanded westward. The Canary Islands were a very, very big one. Now, these are going to be kind of connected, and here's how. A lot of those Portuguese explorers made their way down through West Africa. And as they did this, as they kind of hugged the coastline in Africa, they established trading posts throughout the way, granting those people that manned the trading posts monopolies in trading grain and gold and ivory and slaves. Now, here's kind of the connection. This is one of the things that's important. Now, the reason we're talking about these people that are exploring is because, for one, this is how the United States is kind of found, and for two, this is kind of some of the origins of slavery. Now slavery had been around for pretty much since man. truth be told. So this isn't like the first creation of slavery, but this is kind of the introduction of slavery to the United States, or kind of the origins of slavery as far as the United States goes. Now, again, slavery had been around for well longer than this. It had been in pretty much every dynasty had some sort of slavery, or very, very many. I always hate to say always, because some people find ones that weren't. So as they created all of these outposts in West Africa, particularly with the slaves, they would trade in slaves, and then they would ship them to the Canary Islands, where they were sold, and they were made to work the sugarcane fields, obviously for very big profits for those big farmers. Okay, so West Africa, as they're making their way down, there's a couple of monumental things. A guy by the name of Bartholomew Diaz in 1488 rounds the Cape of Good Hope, which is on the very southern tip of Africa. So that means they made it all the way down the western part of Africa, kind of around the southern tip of Africa. And this gives a good kind of like projection of, hey, this is the way, this is the route to the Indies. We think this is the path. So they're kind of finding kind of this path. All the time, all this information is being kept by the Portuguese as a means to further expeditions for other sailors. Now, eventually, about 10 years later, a guy by the name of Vasco da Gama actually rounds the Cape of Good Hope and does make it up the eastern part of Africa, and then eventually does make it to India. So this is a kind of a big deal. They can kind of directly get those spices from India. Once they make it to India, they find it much easier to get from China and Japan, getting those luxury goods like porcelain and silk. And now kind of they're in business. Portugal is kind of almost established, like, hey, we're the first ones there. It gives them quite a lot of power. Now, as these people are establishing these trade outposts, we see a couple things happen. We see a lot of these sailors are marrying native African women, creating these mixed marriages of European and African people getting married. This also creates really kind of cements their hold into the African slave trade. This is really the in. So this is kind of, these are kind of big deals. Now, from a technological standpoint, the Portuguese are advanced. We talked about the information, the currents and the information as far as developing a map and developing a route. But a couple of things from a technological standpoint give them a big advantage. Something called the quadrant, which establishes, with a pretty high degree of accuracy, can measure like the latitude of a ship. So they can, according to their maps, kind of give a good estimation of where they're really at. When you can't see land, it was a good idea to say, like, hey, this is where we're at. It helps them a lot. And then the other thing is this thing. It is a faster, quicker boat, which makes it, again, faster to go through the water. It also has this big triangular sail, which makes it so it can handle lots of different kinds of weather and wind patterns, as opposed to, and this is what people used to do when they wanted to sail, or they wanted to, ship someplace. They had to go at certain times of the year to make sure their wind was in their direction. People had kind of charted the wind patterns. So this new kind of boat allowed some flexibility in changing the way the sail kind of was positioned to capture the wind, and they could go in make it a lot more flexible in when they could travel, and weren't so beholden to the winds. And the other thing, and this really isn't a technological thing, but really probably something that should be in one of your answers, an expansion of credit and trade. More and more trade was kind of going about, and more people wanted to invest in these expeditions. So the fact they came up with a way to provide credit, meaning you can buy you didn't have to have the physical dollars in your hand. That made it a lot easier to kind of make these moves, for sure. Now, once the Portuguese kind of established this everybody else wants a piece. And that doesn't mean that they were sitting there watching. Other countries obviously were trying to do the same thing the Portuguese were. They were just way out in front. Now, in the late 1400s, this guy, Christopher Columbus, comes along. And he pitches the ideas to lots of different governments. And a lot of people laughed at him. He had these wild ideas. And really the big one was, hey, everybody wants to get to what they call the Orient, like China and Japan and Indies, and they're going around Africa to do it. And he's like, there's a quicker way. If instead of going east, let's go west. And his thought was, it's really not that far if we just keep pushing farther. We already found Newfoundland. He really thought that about 4,000 miles from those Western European countries, they would be able to kind of round the globe and find Japan and China. So a lot of people laughed at him. They thought these were crazy ideas. So he pitches these ideas to all these different places. And eventually the Spanish, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, kind of bite on this idea. And they're coming off of a war with where they finally kind of get rid of the last of the Muslim invaders into their country, something called the Reconquista, which means to kind of reconquer. And as they kick the last of the Muslims out, this seems like a good project to have. They really kind of want to end the Portuguese stranglehold on trade, so their entrance into the mix is to throw their money into Christopher Columbus. Christopher Columbus in 1492 has 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria. My guess is a lot of you have heard of these. And he sets sail. Eventually, when he finds land, he hits what he calls and names San Salvador, which is present-day the Bahamas. He is utterly convinced that he has found the Indies. Like, he's looking, and either that or China, and he's looking for people like, I want to see, like, these, where are all these Chinese emperors, and where's the Chinese Navy, and where's, he's looking and looking and can't really corroborate his story. What he does see is, as he writes in his journal, he finds a lot of people that are primitive in nature, that are not dressed very much. And he's like, that's not what I expected from China or the Indies. So, but he does see that there's gold and other things to be had there, so they settle in San Salvador. He sails to Cuba, what he calls Hispaniola, which is Haiti, and kind of explores there. He calls these native people Indians, so we kind of pick up on that phrase. He sails to a lot of other Caribbean islands. Eventually they make a settlement in Venezuela, and they have a settlement in Hispaniola, which I said is present-day Haiti. So he dies really never knowing that he didn't hit the Indies. He thinks that's where he has found. As we know now, that is not really true. That's not where he found. But that does inspire other sailors. Again, there's others that we don't talk about very much that aren't as successful. One that is pretty big for us is a guy by the name of Amerigo Vespucci, who finds us. Hence America. He names this America after himself, so he's kind of the guy that kind of makes it happen. Now, why does everybody want to colonize? There's a lot of reasons Europeans want to colonize. Obviously, it's an economic boon, but there's also lots and lots of poverty that are going around in Europe. There's a land shortage, there's food shortages, there's low wages, there's unemployment, there's raping and murdering and pillaging, stealing. So there's a lot of fear of violence. There's all this overcrowding. And then in the early mid-1300s, 1347-ish, they have a bout of the Black Death, which eliminates a lot of the population, about a third of the population. Ironically enough, this actually lowers some of it kind of brings the numbers back into whack as far as creates some opportunity as far as more land and raises wages, but it puts some fear in people. So a lot of countries are trying to build other empires, build on their wealth, build on their land capabilities. So they decide to try to explore out this way, explore westward, and develop these colonies. Now, China is not one of those. China has really kind of the best ships, and they have just really kind of advanced culture. They have a lot of land, a lot of luxury goods, and these are some of the reasons they don't decide to engage in exploration like the other countries do. They don't have these problems. They have plenty of land. They have plenty of food. They are a leading producer of goods that a lot of people seem to want. So they don't feel the need for that outward expansion. The other thing is there's a lot of outside threats that are kind of lurking on their borders, particularly the Mongols to the north. So they're afraid of spreading themselves too thin with some exploration. They really want to kind of hunker down at home to make sure they are fortified. This kind of colonization we're going to see is eventually going to weaken China. Not necessarily right now, but we're going to see it's going to happen throughout history. They really don't branch out like some of the other countries do. They don't industrialize when the other countries do, and it's going to hurt them in the long run. I will give you another round of questions coming up here pretty soon. So have a great one.